In 1987, I asked my high school English teacher a question. Given the opportunity, would you travel back to Vietnam? His response? Only if I could stand on Hill 861 again at Khe Sanh. 13 years later, the answer to that question became reality when I traveled halfway around the world to stand on that hill with him.
I've been waiting 32 years for this day. 32 years.
Còn đâu em nhớ xưa rồi em khóc, tôi thoáng buồn thương dòng lệ đài trắng.
I went to a place this summer and I talked to people who are about the age of our seniors who died in a place a long time ago. The chances are real good that none of them had sons. And I spoke to some of those guys this summer, standing on a hill a long way away from here. They'd give anything to have you as one of their sons. Play for them, play for your own families, play for the coaches, play for the school, mostly play for yourselves. One hand in right here. 1, 2, 3!
Someone once told me shadows are like fingerprints to the soul, washing everything it touches, changing shape, moving, a living entity. Vietnam is one of those places that gets inside of you, and it stays with you after you're gone. It's hard to imagine that war once plagued this remote part of the world, and yet, like all things, it has healed over time. Over 3 decades have passed since the shadows of thousands eclipsed this landscape, and some were left for an eternity, leaving just a memory ingrained in the minds of those who remember, the ones who survived. In July 2000, I traveled halfway around the world with Dennis Mannion, my former high school English teacher. He was eager to visit a place that has been with him for 32 years, Hill 861 at Khe Sanh. The siege at Khe Sanh tested the will of nearly 6,000 U.S. servicemen, the majority being just 19 years old. They were given the task of defending Khe Sanh at all costs, a price that many paid with their lives. Khe Sanh is situated in the Central Highlands along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a route the North Vietnamese used to funnel weapons into the South. In December of 1967, the North Vietnamese began massing in and around Khe Sanh, eventually surrounding the Americans with an estimated 40,000 strong. What would transpire in the coming months would change the lives of these young men forever. January 20th, 1968 would be a day that Dennis Mannion would never forget. A day when fate would be on his side.
At about noontime or so, some people in the trench line spotted 4 or 5 North Vietnamese soldiers crawling through the elephant grass on this ridgeline 500 yards away. So the company commander asked me to shoot artillery there. We did. We had about 20 rounds impact right where we really wanted them to hit. And then they organized a patrol to go out the gate over to this ridgeline. And I was so casual about it that I wore my Converse black low sneakers. I didn't even put on my jungle boots. I had a pair of Converse black low sneakers like every kid in America had, and I brought mine with me to Vietnam. And we got to the area where the shells had hit, and there was blood on the elephant grass, and all the elephant grass was chopped up, and the trees were full of shrapnel, cuts from the shrapnel. And we really wanted to jump over the ridgeline out of sight of 861 and follow the blood trails down. We were told to come back immediately. And whoever ran the patrol, the staff sergeant or lieutenant, asked for one more permission to go. And then our captain got on the radio personally and ordered us back onto the hill. We got back to the hill, and Captain Jasper immediately had a staff meeting, and I was included in that as the Fort observer. And what we didn't know, but Captain Jasper had learned, was that at the time we were getting ready to go out on patrol, the North Vietnamese officer had given himself up at the main base. And he held up a white flag, and they went out and got him. They didn't kill him, they went out and got him and gathered him, brought him back inside the wire at the main base. And he hadn't been paid, he had been passed over for promotion, so he decided to give it up and defect. And he told the people down at the base that the hills were going to be attacked at midnight, 861 and 881 South, and that the main base would be attacked when the sun came up. Had we disobeyed radio orders, or had we not been told that, or had the guy not given up that day, I wouldn't be here doing this interview, because just on the other side of the ridgeline was a battalion of North Vietnamese soldiers. 600 guys probably, who attacked us at midnight just like the lieutenant said they would do. And they were all dug in on the backside of that ridgeline, just waiting for darkness. And had I walked down there with my Converse black low sneakers on, I would not have come back.
Later that evening, Dennis and the rest of Kilo Company waited atop Hill 861 for any signs of the impending attack.
10 o'clock turned to midnight, and by midnight you could hear the North Vietnamese outside the barbed wire. They were cutting the wire. You could hear the wire spring back when they cut the wire. Sometimes they detonated mines that we had out there. We threw grenades, but they kept coming. It was terrible up there. Explosions, recoilless rifle, mortars, machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns. And we came across a couple of bodies, Marines who were killed at the top, but we could not even get to the command bunker. So David and I went back down the hill to the landing zone and then got into the trench line and worked our way up to the area where the North Vietnamese were coming through. And we got up as far as we could go until there were no more Marines left. And then we got into a bunker that was dug in the side of the wall, and we conducted artillery missions for the rest of the night from that position. When the sun came up on the morning of the 21st, and we had taken a number of casualties, both wounded and killed, and the North Vietnamese had suffered lots of deaths. There were plenty of North Vietnamese soldiers inside the barbed wire who had died on 861. But a death that has stayed with me for a long time was a guy named Gunny Rimmel. Melvin Rimmel, he was from Dawson, Pennsylvania. He talked about how we had to look out for one another, and when your time was up, and not to worry about that. And he talked about fate and how it's just fate, really. When your fate catches up with you, it catches up with you, and there's nothing you can do about it. I just came around the corner, and there he was in the rising sunlight. And it was staggering, really. I used my two thumbs, and I closed his eyes for him, and I knelt there next to his body, and I cried. And I felt, geez, if he got killed, then we probably all were going to get killed.
Each year, Dennis takes time out from his English class to educate his students about the siege of Khe Sanh, a battle that nearly took his life.
Here. This is in the spring of '67. Members of Gulf Company 2-3 catch their breath during the assault on Hill 861. Right? They are on the edge of a huge...
The first book we read in the class was Things I Carried by Tim O'Brien. It was really the first thing that got me interested in Vietnam and just the whole thing that happened to Mr. Manning when he was there. Sometimes I'd just be sitting and thinking about Mr. Manning's talking, and I mean, he's a really smart guy, so he has a lot to say, and I'll just be sitting thinking about what he's talking about. And back in Vietnam, some of the stuff he says and some of the pictures I look at, I just don't really know how he could have survived it and how anybody could have survived it, because it's a serious thing going on over there. I personally would never want to be there. I'd love to see it. I'd love to go over and visit the place, but I wouldn't wanted to have been there during the war. Mr. Manning's a great guy. I'm glad he survived. I wouldn't want a different English teacher.
In 1987, during my senior year in high school, I was privileged to have Dennis as my teacher, where I learned about Khe Sanh through his experiences, the way they lived and the way they died.
I am a survivor for a lot of reasons, from a lot of places. And in front of you are a bunch of survivors, and we will survive all of this. And good luck to Powder Puff. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Vietnam during the late 1980s was still a relatively closed country to the West. But I had read where some veterans were actually traveling back to Vietnam for the first time. But unfortunately, where they could and could not go was being directed by the Vietnamese government.
The need for me is to go to 861. Everything else is secondary. And I've been saying that for over 20 years, that if I could go back, I need to go to this hill to say goodbye to the people that were killed there and wounded there. And we were on that hill for so many months, and then, as I said, we woke up one morning and bang, we were gone. And there was never any time to say goodbye and to reflect on what we'd done, and there was no time for any kind of closure at all or to come to terms with what happened up there. You were in Vietnam one day, and 2 or 3 days later you were home, you know. I was in Vietnam in a gun battle on Tuesday, and I was in Yale Bowl on Saturday here in New Haven, Connecticut. So I was in a demilitarized zone artillery battle on Tuesday, and then 5 days later I'm in Yale Bowl watching Calvin Hill score touchdowns for Yale against Columbia. I mean, that's pretty fast.
It took Dennis nearly 10 years to openly talk about his experiences at Khe Sanh. In 1978, he was asked to speak to a class of high school students at Choate Rosemary Hall in Wallingford, Connecticut, something he continues to do each year. It was at this very same school in the early 1990s that Dennis was introduced to a student, someone who would bring him closer to the thought of ever returning to Khe Sanh.
I continue to speak at Choate every year, and it was probably 10 years ago, so we're at 2000 now. It was probably in 1990 or 91 that I made a presentation at Choate, and there was a girl who was standing on the periphery of about 10 students, and every time a student would finish and thank me and then leave, the group got smaller and smaller, but she continued to stay on the outskirts. And she said, "I'd like to show you some of these pictures that I took." The first one she showed me was red dust with some old shells and barbed wire, and I said, "That looks like Khe Sanh dust." And she said, "It is Khe Sanh. I was there with my mother last summer." And man, I was jolted. And I said, "You went to Khe Sanh with your mother?" And she said, "Yeah, my mother and I stood right in the middle of where the runway used to be." And that was my first clue that people were actually going back there, and that you could somehow, if time and money and fortune was right, you could do it.
I had kept in touch with Dennis over the years, but it wasn't until 1998 that I called him to talk about Khe Sanh. It was then that I learned of his possible trip back to Khe Sanh, and more importantly, Hill 861. In 1996, Dennis had met Glenn Prentice at a Khe Sanh Veterans Reunion in Washington, D.C. He hadn't seen nor spoken to Glenn since he left Khe Sanh in April of 1968. It was there in the basement of the convention hall that Dennis finally realized that his desire to return to Khe Sanh was now a real possibility.
We were in the basement of the reception room there for the reunion, and I stood with Glenn and I looked at his pictures, and he had gone up on the hills on his own. He didn't go with a tour, he just went on his own. Hired a guide and a translator and walked up there. So I knew it was possible, you know, I knew it was possible, and it was really Glenn who gave me the motivation and the window of opportunity to lift up that window and step in. So that's the genesis for that.
It's a big step.
It's a big step, and it took a long time. I tried the year before, and it just, you know, it was too sudden here, and too sudden for me, and too sudden for my wife, and you know, I thought about it for another year and stayed in contact with Glenn, and we finally put it together. I'm hoping I get there. I mean, I'll get there physically. I'm hoping I get there psychologically. That's what I want to happen. And I've said closure to people that don't know me very well. I talk to people in some of the schools I've been to or been asked to speak to. I mention the word closure, but my wife is right. It's not closure for me. It's not going to be closure. It's just going to be put it more in a compartment where I can have it, but don't have to have it as accessible or out there in front of me. You know, put it behind me rather than in front of me. So I think going there might help move it from in front of my face to over behind me somewhere. It still lingers. It's ongoing. You know, I don't fight the battles anymore, but I haven't forgotten it. Unforgettable, really.